Good evening everyone, and welcome again to our Monday Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge for Street Fighter V. I am Kansuki Dynasty, and we have Brilliant here as well on mic. And we are going to be getting back to the battle lounging. If you want to join our lounge today, you can do it the same as always by searching out 3 rounds, first to 2, with character select off, and look for Rune Siren. So without further ado, let's get going.
Today we have a convergence of circumstances, which all come together to give us an interesting topic. When one goes to tournaments, you have to play for long periods. But what exactly that means to every player changes based on both their character and their overall fighting style. Some players have a lot of automatic reactions and make their decisions based on lots and lots of training, having done it beforehand, and others play in a very analytical way that makes them make a lot of decisions. Characters may cause this, or just their natural style may cause it, or of course a combination of the two. Today, however, we are relatively certain that all of the team members that normally join are tired. Despite a relatively simple weekend, a lot of those different circumstances have pushed it to the point where everyone's more or less exhausted. But there are different types of exhausted. And the fatigue you get from a long day of work may or may not affect you depending on what your work is. Fighting games have multiple aspects that differently tire the mind. There is the focus to keep aware of what is going on as a whole, and separately the focus to actually make decisions about what to do in reaction to or as part of your plan relative to those things. Part of the reason why pros train as consistently and as hard as they do is to remove that aspect of the game, so that even when they are mostly tired, unless their opponent is posing an extreme strain and threat in terms of decision making or reactions, they can probably still play through even if they're relatively tired. That said, at the highest levels of play, this tends to still be an issue, and that's why you hear commentators talking about how exhausted a player must be after basically going through what is the equivalent of like 10 matches, because that's usually what a top 8 is to any given player. Even in a 3 to 5, even in a first to 3 top 8, generally most players will play, especially if they're going through the winning side, let's not use an average, let's talk about the maximum number of games they could play and still end up going through as winners. The most games you could generally need to play is 30. Depending on whether or not you're starting from top 16 or top 8. And you do get breaks between these games, but that sort of break does not generally erase decision fatigue all that easily. Awareness fatigue, you can probably give yourself some moments with your mind quiet and your eyes closed and other things like that, but decision fatigue is a strange function of the brain that we mostly see come in when people are trying to answer questions in exams or under tight situations. The interesting thing about decision fatigue is that the faster and more quote-unquote random the game you're playing is, the more difficult it is. The more straining and taxing it is. Sometimes you have to slow yourself down and just believe that your own autopilot, your physical capability, your general awareness and trained responses will see you through a situation. But if you know that your own autopilot is relatively poor or easily decoded by any opponent watching, it can be harder to trust in this, making us more likely to try really hard to make sure that we are making all the right decisions. And of course, getting tired even faster. So, we do have more than just the usual team today, and therefore we do have multiple opponents. All of whom require different styles of play and therefore also are more likely to push on that autopilot and that decision making. You can fall into some habits at least when facing a known opponent or when facing an opponent you faced for a while, but a consistent barrage of relatively new opponents with unknown skills and unknown approaches to the game can put some strain on you. Similarly, if a common opponent has developed a new skill, style, or trick, let's say, adapting to that and making sure you make the right decision, especially if it's a mix-up, can be straining, even though it is a mix-up and technically you don't really have to make a decision most of the time. You already know the rest of the person's style, you already understand the rest of their flow. You could probably make the decisions based on that alone, but unfamiliar things push the human mind to try to find patterns, leading to additional stress. Top level players use different specific strategies to manage playing under high fatigue conditions. One decent way is to give yourself a round or two where you only autopilot and don't really care about the win or loss condition. When used early enough into a match, this can cause your opponent to think you have a specific plan when all you really did was turn off your brain. Especially if this happens to go decently well and you find yourself, oh wait, I'm kind of winning here. Maybe I could like turn on my brain for the second half of this match and actually take it. Others, of course, just rely entirely on their fundamentals. Play very solidly, very safely, without specifically trying to win so much as they're trying to not lose. For some fortunate people, depending on their defensive style, those two are the same thing. But it can matter which one you choose based on whether or not your opponent has good offense or is priding themselves on their own defense, wanting to play footsies, etc. Sometimes all you really need to be able to do is stop yourself from doing the one autopilot thing that loses you the matchup, especially in unfamiliar matchups. When not in an unfamiliar matchup, it can be easy enough to manage to keep this sort of thing up. Crush counters and long hit stun are another good way that this game assists with this, since it can give you some time to recognize when the situation has changed in your favor. Whereas older games generally give you much shorter time overall to verify, oh wait, I get to do damage now, it's my turn. When facing an opponent whose intent is to play on that aspect of your current state, there's not always anything you can do other than try to avoid the situations where they will manipulate you altogether. This may involve literally running from certain situations in ways you normally would not, or not challenging in positions where you otherwise would. Avoiding getting frame trapped, avoiding getting knocked down with certain moves. Just giving up some forms of your own control and damage to prevent yourself from being manipulated by your opponent's flow. This of course depends heavily on the character. Characters that are able to quickly close the distance and return to the same stressful situation that you were just in are more dangerous in this way than others. Karin being exactly this type of character. While all this is going on, Each skill or fatigue skill compounds into itself in more or less the same way. Your decision-making slips, your awareness slips, and finally your execution slips.
Show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight!
I know I often have trouble when I get sufficiently tired where I end up sort of losing control of my autopilot, because I normally suppress the more aggressive or a set of like aggressive and sort of uncontrolled and not really the best idea patterns that emotionally I would otherwise sometimes get into, and I end up running out of control, focus to control that, and sometimes I have to end up doing that sort of letting go that Rillian was mentioning and playing in not necessarily the best ways as a result. Which sometimes works because it is just a bit wild, but it's not really how I'd like to play normally, and the stronger my opponent, the less well it works. I've actually been working on recently, trying to deal with those sorts of habits as like a main focus of what I'm doing, on current at least, because it gets in the way of all of the awareness and patience and such that I've been learning from Sakura and other such things. So I feel like, although I am definitely tired as she describes, I'm not necessarily having as much trouble with that today. And I'm not sure if that's just my stamina for that hasn't quite worn out yet, or if it is in fact that a little bit of that training at least has paid off. Time will tell, I suppose, since there's still a long night ahead of us. One thing that my focus on this of late has done is it's made me more aware of when it's getting started, which I find helps in terms of not letting myself effectively get into the rut quite as easily. And since my tactic for dealing with this is, in fact, relaxing, hopefully it will help, like, spend less stamina to begin with.
You win. It's go time.
But for the moment, since I didn't get to play Sakura against Suntier effectively over the weekend, I'm gonna do a bit of that now.
Let's do this.
We tried a little bit, but we ended up having trouble with lag, so hopefully our network is better today than it was yesterday. Well, Saturday.
Round one. Fight.
Oh wow, now my lack of focus is transferred back.
Round two. Fight.
A large part of what makes this more difficult for less seasoned, less experienced players is the fact that their meter usage is not automatic. It's usually actually a decision. Or when it is automatic, it's usually in a defensive panic situation and not specifically a tactical one.
You win.
This leads to the two obvious flaws that you'd expect. The first being that if your meter usage is automatic, your opponent will find a situation that causes you to use it and consume your meter for you, relatively speaking. Whether or not this ends up leaving you open is dependent on your character, but certainly having less meter available, particularly if your opponent blocks well, is not good for you.
Round 2. Fight.
There are not a lot of ways around this. You can go into the matchup reminding yourself from the beginning, from your notes, from your memory, what exactly your plan for meter is in that matchup. And this can put it somewhat at the forefront of your mind, at least enough that if you do have to make a decision, it's a quick one. It's not recalling something new or something you haven't thought about in a while. It's, okay, I knew this was going to happen, I knew this was coming, and then that moment of recognition that you have meter is enough to solve your problem. The V meter is even more difficult to use in this way than the CA gauge because not only is it often at the periphery of our consciousness, we can see it, but we're not thinking about it in the same way as the other. A lot of V cancels come out of specific situations that we're familiar with, and if those situations don't come up, neither does that moment that we think of using the V meter. This is particularly limiting when what you really need in a given situation is V reversal, but you don't normally V reversal in that situation for whatever reason.
Final round.
Which leads to a very direct correlation between being tired and it being harder to get out of pressure. Since you don't V reversal out, even when it's probably the better idea given the opponent you're facing, simply because it's not in your autopilot and since you're tired, doesn't happen.
There's also the problem of if you're playing a new character, learning a new matchup or a new skill, or just trying to practice something specifically, you may end up spending more focus on this than you would otherwise, simply because it's sort of new to you and maybe you have to think about it, maybe you have to just grind it, but you do have to pay attention to it, otherwise it won't be part of your autopilot.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
It is partially because of these factors that characters who have to play straight footsies, who have no relatively wild move that lets them go, okay, I'm not playing footsies right now, I'm just going to hit anything you stick out semi-randomly.
Final round.
Tend to tire out the opponent a bit faster. As the game is now, though, there are not that many characters who don't have any of those.
Why does that tire out the opponent rather than the person playing that character? Or is it that, I think I missed something.
There, just now you demonstrated it. Sakura can just Tatsu in neutral. It's not always the best idea, but there's a lot of stress that goes onto your opponent's side when they are trying to recognize a situation where you are planning or could Tatsu in neutral. And most buttons, most footsie playing that they would want to do, stand mediums, crouch mediums, they just don't work against it.
You win. It's go time. Let's do this.
Don't worry. I'll end you quickly.
Round one. Fight.
A foolish insect that dares to defy me.
Round two. Fight.
You can't. I'll savor this.
Final round. Fight.
Urian's knee is a good example of what I'm talking about. One can have the feeling that you need to play footsies, and then Urian just stops that and goes over your button and comes down on your head.
You lose.
And when tired, it's not as helpful to have a concept of, well, these characters have to play footsies and these ones don't, these ones are more likely to and these ones aren't. You're too tired and you'll just play whatever you're used to as your norm.
Round two. Fight.
You can't run.
You win. Round one. Fight.
How irritating.
Round two. Fight.
Different styles of play lose different aspects of their strengths when the player is tired. Some players become what most people consider more sloppy because they do more things or miss more things that are visibly different than they do normally. But there is another way that this can be seen, and it's harder to recognize. The situation where a player has shifted to playing more defensively does not necessarily mean that they failed their punishes. But it can mean that they will sometimes fail to capitalize on things that they normally would. Since these things can often be subtle and difficult to identify, especially if you don't play the same character, the sloppiness in question is not easily seen.
Let's do this.
This one may be a little spotty. We expect to still see some issues with the connection distance and the difference in internet service overall, but the match between these two players isn't often so dependent on close range play that the lag is strictly a problem. It just means that Suntear has to block a lot more than he normally would and throw more red fireballs than he normally would. Offense becomes a little spottier to do. Fortunately, Urien is not exactly the trickiest frame trappy character, so during those moments in which you can see things like the movement of fireballs, you can get a lot out of just flowing through the correct spaces, rather than thinking about things like pressure or which buttons to hit.
When I was playing Cosmic Wolf myself, I feel like I ended up being limited somewhat by my tiredness, but I can't necessarily put my finger on exactly why.
Because you don't like blocking.
Suppose that probably contributes.
It's really specific, actually.
I definitely
As
recognize...
I said, Urien isn't that tricky a character. He tends to control the situation more so than he tends to trick you about what the situation is.
I see.
Round 2. Fight.
But he can absolutely become what is effectively a tricky character if the player in question doesn't want to defend, or if the player on the Urien side can move at the speed of Nemo and make defense not feel like a valid option in the first place. Because Urien is not usually planning to make you make a mistake in punishing his moves. He's just happy to be able to get away most of the time. Meaning that sometimes you can afford to just wait after he's done a move. Even if you evaded it or ended up in a space you didn't expect, he went over your head, whatever else. Because he's not necessarily going to try to kill you immediately.
Right.
Even at higher levels of play, this tends to be true.
And even if he does want to do things, if I manage to evade and at least be somewhat away from him, all of his options for actually approaching quickly are charge. So I have time to reset. I suppose I can see how I would have had the opportunity to be much, much more patient with him throughout those matches. Which probably honestly would have made it a completely different game. So I guess I can't necessarily say how exactly it would go, but there would probably be less of me randomly getting hit by him. And I don't
At that point,
technically
Urian normally
need to be
switches to his
forced.
zoning and can control space really well with it, because whenever that interaction happens, if you don't pursue him, if you don't try anything daring, he gets to reposition, and he gets to build his charge. In order to prevent Urian from building charge or using his zoning tools, you have to at least try to do that. And he's a character that is good at punishing you for trying and whiffing, or any other things, because he has long enough buttons, and he has good combos off a lot of those buttons if he's really focused.
I see. In that case, is it perhaps that my tired took away my balance between those two states? And that ended up being my problem.
I would say that's what it looked like to me, because you did get into the positions where Urian was just successfully zoning, but by the time you got there, he already also had Aegis. Now, Cosmic Wolf can zone you anyway, he does not care. He will find a way. But your side would not have felt so weird, probably.
I see. Yes, I remember actually switching to defensive, or a more patient state, when he finally did get Aegis up. But at that point it was more so, well, there's nothing else I'm going to be doing until he finishes wasting this. So I did spend a little time noting that Sakura's fireballs have very variable ranges, and I can simply throw them to counter his own, or just to throw them, maybe gain a little meter, and not have them reflected back at me if I don't want to. With the added
Urian
convenience.
players often have an option here, if they're really, really dedicated, to use the headbutt in these situations and solve their problem that way. But this is a little harder than it seems, because it involves knowing exactly how long you've been holding your down charge. And since a lot of the interactions we're talking about are ones in which Urian has not necessarily known what side he was on, whether or not it was time to go for a combo or whatever else, charge characters often have to build up this skill of, even though you are not planning to hit a crouching button in the situation that's about to come up, you should probably hold crouch anyway in case you miss or something.
Round one.
This isn't really the same thing we're seeing in this match. This is basically playing as you'd expect it, playing as it's quote-unquote supposed to. Akuma is not really a match where Cosmic Wolf wants to shift around too much, given that he does tend to prefer zoning with Urian. But even when a more offensive Urian is fighting Akuma, you will not often see the same all-out offense style, because if Akuma clips you with any of his counter pokes, you're probably going to be on your back. and he can outmaneuver a ton of things, as just been demonstrated twice. So deciding, okay, I'm going for this now, isn't the safest or quickest option for you as the Urian player, whereas Akuma is good at getting in, but Urian has such long buttons that if he can keep a certain space, Akuma's mix-ups on the way in tend to disappear.
How irritating.
He has to do a lot more with EX meter, he has to do a lot more with very long jump normals, and since Akuma lacks a really long jumping heavy kick, or rather one that hits in the way that he gets the combo off of most of the time, he ends up relying a lot on very specific timings and spacings for his air fireball, which Urian can basically just deal with. This means that a lot of the time, rather than being able to hit buttons, Akuma must do as you've just seen done there. Use the same spacings as he would to tempt Urian into hitting a button to check his advance, and then just throw a fireball instead. This is because, unlike most other fireball characters, Akuma's fireballs knock down at that range. Even if they don't always knock down, he has a lot of different ways to make them able to do so. Meaning he can get his pressure and keep the opposing Urian down using that approach at least some of the time. This is compounded by the fact that most of Urian's longer normals, which he would use to check a standard walking approach from Akuma, are standing ones, meaning that he does not get to use the violent knee drop to go over the fireball on reaction. Even if he could, it's not usually very easy given that it's just usually a very fast reaction to have to do. But unlike trying to hit him with the air fireball and having him go over it entirely, you can just use it to cover space so Urian can't dash forward or do tackle or anything like that, land in front of him, and then make a split-second decision: am I throwing a fireball, am I waiting for him to move in a way that I can uppercut, or am I going in?
Round one. Fight.
Ryu does not have the same options overall, obviously because he does not have air fireballs. However, Ryu does not take any damage when parrying Urian's projectiles. Meaning it's relatively easy for him to build up a lot of V-meter by getting Urian to throw 2 fireballs. Basically that's it. This is similar to fighting Sagat. Get Urian to throw the first, parry the second, and advance. Because then the Urian player has to think about whether or not they should be throwing more fireballs. And that's all you need. You need to make them think about it. Once you have your V trigger, you have a lot more tools for dealing with a bunch of Urian stuff. Which in turn makes him more twitchy, which means you get more punishes off a lot of things. Limiting Urian's idea of good movement means that he's more likely to try to hold his charge, and you have a lot more options.
Round two. Fight.
There are many characters in the game that Ryu has this difficult but not entirely overwhelming requirement in the match. If he sees them standing or walking backward, throw a fireball. But the fireball is not necessarily intended to hit them. It's intended to make them think about something, change the spacing, or something similar. Many of these characters don't do too well once Ryu corners them. For many reasons relative to things like that, slight maneuvering changes that shift in and out, and Ryu actually has fairly long buttons, as much as people were confused about how they were meant to be used before. It has a lot to do with the way that his body moves around during other moves. Then he recovers and he whiff punishes stuff that was slightly too far away. It would have been close enough had he been recovered fully, but he was a little too far forward at whatever time. One decent option for Urien is to follow his fireballs with dashes, as you've just seen instead, but for going up against Ryu, you can still end up in a lot of trouble for this, as Ryu doesn't have to stand in the same places as other characters, meaning that usually the throw attempt will whiff. And he does have a 5-frame medium punch with a good set of damage that comes off of it, as well as certain really good spacings for uppercuts, and of course the parry itself, meaning you can't just hit buttons every time, you have to at least offer some credibility of a mix-up.
Round 2. Fight.
But as noted, the longer a Ryu player has to keep this sort of thing up, the less likely it is that their timing will be perfect on various things. We tend to autopilot, and specific moves from other players, especially other characters with variability that we're not used to, can result in a bunch of weird things happening. Parries become harder, throw spacings become harder, and so on.
Urien wins. Round 1. Fight.
The upside to this is that building up as much V-meter as Ryu has means that basically nearly every stand medium punch leads to something relatively large damage-wise compared to his normal situation.
Round 2.
Decision fatigue is part of cracking, as people often put it.
Alright, back again. Now time to try being a little more balanced and blocking a little more. Maybe. It's interesting how tired takes these sorts of things away from you, because if you have awareness of what you need to be doing or adjusting in that sort of way, it's probably not like it's all that impossible to do. But if you're sufficiently tired that, like, what you would normally do gets adjusted a little bit as a result, you're not necessarily going to notice or possibly be able to correct your autopilot. But
Round one.
even still,
Fight. Round two. Fight.
I suppose partly in my case it might be that my awareness goes down as to where it's appropriate to do those sorts of things. Whereas if I had higher awareness, maybe that would just happen automatically.
What you just did is a good example of this. Urian's Violence Knee is actually super easy to beat if you aren't playing footsies. If you get to the same spot in the same cycle and then just don't hit the footsie button, but Urian does the move anyway, it's super easy to stop. Nearly every character in the game, their forward jumping medium punch will hit him.
Fight.
For some, you get neutral jump, a heavy kick on the way down and stuff like that, which is even more damage. This is partially why Urian players often use the headbutt in the same position so as to move closer rather than trying to get over to trick the footsie situation. But if you decide you're going at Urian because you're at a space where you can, and Urian has enough charge to do that move, chances are it will hit you instead. Since nearly all moves that are far enough reaching to threaten someone like that in that position also fall against Violence Knee. Leaving you suffering and asking, why do I keep hitting this button?
Round two. Fight.
And the interesting thing about that is, at least for Urian, the answer is usually, there's no reason. If you think about the matchup, if you think about the character, the thing you're thinking of doing to get in on him is wrong. It's almost always wrong. Always remember that when a person plays one type of character in one game, whatever nuances make them like that character probably are the same nuances that you can apply to their character in other games. In this case, Cosmic Wolf has this effect on people when playing Axel, and it's the same thing on Urian. People keep on wanting to go in without thinking about whether or not the position they're trying to do so from is actually a good position to do it.
Final round. Fight.
And this is because the character is so good at making you feel as if, well, if I don't go in now, when will I ever get to go in? Playing defensively or playing too slowly and calming down does not resolve the situation. It just compounds it, honestly. Because Urian can hit you from across the screen. He's just a little less safe doing it than Axel is. But you can at least consider whether or not the way you've decided to approach is actually helpful to you. For example, Urian absolutely loves people that get pushed out of his range and then jump, as the character is basically able to convert into 300 damage off of just the anti-air.
You win.
Is that with his CA, or does he have another way?
No, he can just do that, like normally.
Let's see, what would he use for that?
He has at least 5 ways to do this.
I see. Well, that obviously sounds like trouble.
Let's do this.
If you're familiar with our Nashbot, it's for this reason that we often try to advise when you are fighting Nashbot, don't try too hard. The entire purpose of Nashbot is to let you sort of watch what you're doing when you're not trying too hard, when you're just playing automatically. This is why he has no points that are technically difficult to get. If you don't know how to punish Nash with your character, it's a matter of finding which punish, but most of the time there's nothing specific or special that he has that you don't use on anyone else. The most recent training has moved on to BirdieBot, and BirdieBot for Alex is often helpful in understanding when you're pushing yourself too hard, when you're pushing too many buttons and you don't actually have advantage, and your opponent could throw you or otherwise stress you out. He also, however, helps you with recognition of spaces where you can do long moves, as it's relatively required in order to put any pressure on him at all. So you can use it to increase your ability to play that sort of pokey Alex game that some players are very fond of. It is definitely true to say that most grapplers in this game do not stand up to the level that Alex does in terms of just being able to hit buttons from far out and not care if the opponent blocks them or not. He's also one of the best characters in the game at using his buttons to move himself in ways that the opponent could run into them, which is a super helpful skill in a lot of situations. Not needing to walk and just being able to put out a threat in front of you to change your position relative to the opponent means you can spend a lot more time charging and a lot more time calmly retreating in situations where other people need to shimmy and create some sort of feeling of moving back and forth, and one can get their legs clipped or whatever else. Alice is usually too far out for things like leg clips. The few characters that can do it to him are not characters he worries a whole ton about other than Kareem. Even Sakura, who is functionally just as good as Kareem in terms of hitting X here or Y here, cannot approach at the same speed Kareem can without telegraphing it at least a little bit. Meaning that Alex gets to activate his V trigger, parry the incoming Tatsu or whatever else he thinks is coming, and then he's done. More importantly, if Sakura chooses to hold back on that, and Alex uses the parry in such a way that he ends up going into the sledgehammer, it's not usually all that dangerous for him to do. He can take a little damage if Sakura is super patient, but if Sakura was super patient, he probably didn't need to use the sledgehammer at all. That's just a call you make in matches and don't worry about it too much. So you can already see some of the effect of Birdie Bot training. Recognizing how to move around using just normals, and recognizing when the opponent is going to try to move, and when you actually shouldn't challenge it all that hard. Being a grappler, he's also one of the better characters for cashing in on the amount of gray health he does.
Round one. Fight.
So in terms of the concept of a character who could win off of basically just white damage, Alex can probably get fairly close. He obviously must hit you to cash it in, but he has to do a lot less actual hitting than a lot of characters in this game, and he's really good at getting just random, simple, stray hits. One of his biggest difficulties, therefore, is deciding whether or not he wants to go for parry or use his V-reversal in specific places. Generally, Alex should go for V-reversal when he is in mid-screen, and use parry when he has pushed the opponent toward the corner. Even if they escape, he's still fine, and if they're trying to get him, they will be less able to push him back to the corner themselves. Well, safely anyway. In mid-screen though, if he feels that there's some problem he has with the opponent putting up too much control, or things getting too close for comfort, he's often better off using his V-reversal there, as it pushes them quite a way back. And if their spacing was so good that he had to worry about playing neutral, throwing them off guard with just V-reversal of some long button or similar can be a good way to shift that whole paradigm for him and get something else started.
That was fun. To my great glee, however, I've discovered that Hogasho can dodge his head crush stuff. Although I have no idea how I'll actually manage to make effective use of that for anything.
Alex is also one of the stronger characters in the game for dealing with characters who have unconventional styled uppercuts, where they don't in fact make themselves crush counterable. If Alex charges up before baiting an uppercut, ooh, built early there. If he charges up his hard hit before baiting an uppercut, it does not really matter what type of uppercut the opponent uses. They could use one that is not crush counterable, and it will still be crush countered. Alex can use this to play even further mind games by doing this and then instead of baiting the uppercut, going for command grab. The reason why this is important a lot of the time is that there are quite a few things that are functionally not crash counterable but are throw invincible, such as Nash's Sonic side. Alex is the character in the game who can get full damage off these, full crush counter level damage off these moves, even though, obviously, they're not crush counterable.
Round 2. Fight.
Combine this with DeWolf's uncanny ability to feel what the opponent is going to do in certain mix-ups, and you have stress from every direction. An incredibly hard to bait player, playing a character who generally doesn't have so many invincible style options as to be easily baited in the first place.
Looks like I won. All right.
Final round. Fight.
When your character is not so overwhelming as to stress out the opponent in that way, their ability to just use standard tactics to get out of these situations can stifle your ability to trick them into making mistakes that you could punish heavily, as they're willing to be more patient, wait for their damage knowing that their character can do a lot of it, and so on, rather than trying to get out of a situation because, oh, I'm squishy and I have a lot of power from my uppercut anyway or whatever, I might as well do it. Alex has none of those things, but as a result, his flow is very much calculated.
In that case, tired didn't necessarily help, but I think the problem was more so that I didn't really have a very clear plan for how to approach DeWolf's Alex. So I sort of ended up doing my defaults in a slightly aggressive manner. I had no idea how to figure out when to actually try to hurt him, or rather, perhaps how to try to hurt him, such that I could figure out a when.
I'd say the main reason for that is that you still don't use Sakuра's crouching moves to fill space. You tend to be intent on them hitting.
I see.
That is in fact how the most things that Akuma does against Alice work out. Especially from the beginning, if Akuma is willing to use more sweep, more crouch medium kick, things intended to get Alex's legs or get him off his feet, to control the space in front of him, and give himself some freedom to move, occasionally he's going to get hit for trying these things. But Alex also isn't the character where if you're doing your good long pokes from max range, that he's going to convert into a massive amount of damage either. His stand medium punch does help quite a bit with this, but overall, Akuma can get a fairly decent start from just aiming at Alex's legs and using his fireballs. Now this isn't strictly the main requirement for the match. Akuma has all sorts of approach options, but the more aware the Alex is, and the calmer they are, the more likely it is that the crouching kicks are going to be important. Oh, that goes through. No, it doesn't. I was about to say that goes through 2 hits, but no, it just hits while that's happening.
Round 1. Fight.
Another feature of BirdieBot. Since BirdieBot does his super soak relatively often, you have to be fairly daring in certain situations. That's be the best way to put it. You can furthermore see the openings this creates for Akuma as a whole, without actually shifting too much else of what he does. It's not the openings themselves are different, but rather that the Akuma player is more likely to see them. And, since Alex is now pinned down in positions where he doesn't want to walk away, for risk of being hit by the same moves, it's easier for Akuma to set up other stuff. Alex can of course make some comebacks and pushes based on using the flash chop to space himself, but this does not often grant him offense. And if he has enough charge for head crush, usually not stomp, if he has enough charge for head crush, he may be able to get something. Aside from that, he has to be fairly daring about this. But once you've gotten enough meter, it's not too hard to be daring.
Final round. Fight.
Ooh, fell a little short on the execution of that one. And that was another fall short of execution. For those who do not know, Alex's EX air knee does go through Akuma's air fireball and hit him. So that the cancel was intended to pause long enough to make that input, but unfortunately it came out as sweep instead. From the Akuma side, there's not much you can do as soon as you've decided to make the jump at all. Alex does have the ability to do that into air knee smash. It's just that I note this to point out that even the air fireball will not save you if that is Alex's plan. One of the characters in the game most able to straight up counter Akuma's air fireball. There is even a timing at which some Alex players can get through the EX air fireball, but this requires that they delay their stuff, which is hard to get yourself to do perfectly, so there's problems there.
Looks like you could use more training.
Round 2. Fight.
I got it.
While Alex can respace himself with the flash top, as you've seen Akuma hitting the crouch heavy punch. While this is not a perfect solution, there are not a whole lot of buttons that Alex is going to want to hit that won't lose to that one. Flash chop is -4 and pushes the opponent back to a spacing where Alex is generally not too able to do a bunch of things.
Alex wins.
So it looks like that match has evolved to its next level, and we'll probably be seeing more of it in the coming weeks.
Let's do this.
But as we get even further into the stream, you obviously should expect even more fatigue. This can be really stressful on Ryu in this matchup, as he doesn't have any really strong ways of pressuring or opening Alex up, other than more or less rushing at him and hitting either stand medium kick
Fight.
or medium tatsu. It basically becomes a race to who can do the most white damage and not make any mistakes in the process. Note that we're speaking of this from the perspective of a player who is fatigued enough to start worrying about the effectiveness of their buttons, their execution, to start worrying that things aren't going to go right when they have to react very quickly. White health is a nice little backup
Round two.
against this type of stress, in that it lets you get something out of standard footsies, even if your opponent is managing to perfectly defend everything. Another decent option that we offer players in general, and therefore have built up entire katas around, 3 of them, we mention fairly often, is that when you're feeling stressed out, tired, or unable to deal with situations, backdash. It will not win you matches most of the time unless your opponent is super aggressive, but it will keep you out of trouble and give you just enough time to think about where you are, maybe take a look at your meters, maybe take a look at your opponent's meter. Unless you're in a situation where the backdash chase is a problem, just backdash. You can even do this in the corner sometimes if you're really confident your opponent is going to do certain things relative to throwing you or something.
You win. Round one. Fight.
Another good reason for the backdash is to remind you that you're too tired or not intending, for whatever reason in the matchup, to play footsies. This is something we noted very important in low levels of Under Night and Birth. If you don't feel like playing footsies, if you don't think you can challenge, please backdash. In this game, you can be chased. In Guilty Gear and Eunice, you're invincible. Just backdash. Decision fatigue is also affected by how quickly you have to make multiple decisions. Backdashing allows you to change this and lessen the amount of decisions you have to make in a certain period of time, giving you a little time to reset yourself after making one incorrectly. Since fighting games are about mix-ups, there's never any way to be absolutely sure of making the right decision. But we count the incorrect decision as the one that makes you get hit. Backdashing can also be a good way to reset your understanding of the distance between you and the opponent and when you had the win condition and didn't. In other words, you can use backdashes to remind yourself, oh wait, I have the life lead.
How does that work exactly? Just taking the time to observe it in between?
Many of us find ourselves approaching because we're used to the idea of approaching. Or feeling like, I can't defend enough to win this.
I see.
It's a fairly common problem actually, that the feeling of, if I give my opponent enough room, they're going to figure out to get in on me and then I'm going to lose.
So if you can get yourself to backdash, you're sort of moving yourself closer to a mindset where either you're going to be hyper aware of the amount of health you have left, or you're going to remember effectively that, wait, maybe I don't have to like constantly be going in, and sort of reset as a result of that.
Most of us associate backdashing with the fact that we want to create space between us and our opponent because somehow that is the win condition. I mean backdashing in neutral. If you backdash in neutral, it's usually because somehow putting space between you and your opponent is your win condition. Remembering that this is a potential win condition, even when you can't necessarily treat it as one as a whole, but you have the life lead, can maybe remind you, wait, this is a win condition. At the moment, if I could last for however long seconds with this amount of life lead, I could just win. I wouldn't have to be able to beat their character. Dashing away can help you remember that your opponent's character is not necessarily the threat at that time. If you could run away from them for the entire 40 seconds, then you could win regardless of what character you're fighting. You wouldn't need to be able to hit them, you wouldn't need to be able to break their defense, you wouldn't necessarily, depending on the distance, even need to be able to play footsies. You just aren't there to play with. Now, again, this isn't necessarily the way you want to play the match at all, but it can stop you from going in and basically giving things up because you feel you must, and that's usually bad. Going in because you feel you have to go in leads to mistakes, leads to you leaving yourself open in ways that your opponent can deal with. And usually, the most important thing is that it allows your opponent to deal with you without using their meter. And their meter is the thing they're going to use to try to get in on you. If you can force them to use up their meter repeatedly, when they're at that distance on the screen, they're not building any. They'll eventually run out of methods to get in on you, and you could stop being so afraid in the first place. Or they'll have to do something risky that you might be able to counter. Even if they do it like 3 times, you only counter it the 3rd time. Depending on how much payoff the move has, you might still just win.
Round 2. Fight.
Sometimes you can do similar things with just walking your opponent to the corner because, hey, if they're in the corner, I have a great advantage, I'm likely to win this match. This position, for example, is dangerous because Alex has full meter. He can just kill Ryu from here. Amara got away, but that could have ended differently simply because Alex has like jump medium punch or something. And I believe his jump medium punch does go into his super. But we do note, once again, fatigue shifts this ability to recognize this situation. And that is why it is helpful to program in things like, oh, I should backdash, just as a way of resetting that.
Let's do this.
This sort of stamina conservation is super important because you don't always know what the stress level presented by any given opponent is going to be. As we mentioned before, for Amara, this matchup is fairly stressful. Just as an executional perspective, Ryu has to constantly know exactly when to throw a fireball against Urian and when not to. And that is a lot of watching, a lot of understanding, a lot of patiently thinking through where Urian wants to be and probably why he's standing up or hitting a button at any given moment, while still blocking all his stuff that he happens to do from more or less full screen, and parrying his fireballs.
These long waits always end up interesting.
Without stamina conservation strategies, you might end up losing to opponent A, well, opponent B, simply because opponent A tired you out so much, and no other reason.
Sounds like a really miserable way to lose at a tournament.
It tends to suck, yes.
There's not even anything to do better for that. Just gotta increase your stamina.
The usual answer is basically just train harder, which isn't really the most encouraging of feelings after you've gone through all that trouble to get to the top level of a tournament and basically fall apart in top 8 because it's like a terrible feeling, and especially that situation. You gave it your all to get into top 8 and then were able to look at your next opponent and go, really? There is no way I can beat that person in my current state. So I get to get into top 8, probably on stream, and fall apart. Because I can't do it. I can't do enough anymore. For some people, it would actually be better to just not do it at all. Depending on how you take things like being on stream, being seen in particular situations, how big the tournament is, and so on, you might not even want to do that. See if you can win your match into top 8 without tiring yourself out. And if you can't, again, if you're hungry for it, if you feel as if this will get you something in your life, absolutely. But if you're just going to end up regretting it and feeling embarrassed or stressed out that you potentially didn't perform well,
Round 1. Fight.
at least put in the mental effort to recognize, oh, maybe I should not, like, push myself that hard right now. Similarly, it's important to recognize, even if you've decided, you know what, I am going to go through with it, I am going to push my hardest, I may just manage to win, even though I'm having trouble focusing right now. So I'm going to go into top 8, give it my all, and show the stream my best. But you have to accept it's not necessarily going to be your best. And maybe you can cope with any embarrassment or failure that comes out of it that way. It's important to consider whether or not this is something you can deal with, though. There's nothing worse than going to a tournament and not recognizing your actual mental state, and then doing too well.
Just in the sense that it increases your exposure, or that somehow it's not replicable, that you manage to maybe get lucky, or just somehow get through?
There are a lot of people with a lot of different mindsets about what it means to go on stream and lose badly. And when I say lose badly, I don't mean get bodied, because anyone can get bodied. I mean fail to do things you've trained and trained over and over, because you're just too tired to do them correctly.
can imagine that must be really hard for some of the top players at like larger tournaments or such, where they are getting like 30 matches up to winners or such for like Evo or maybe Combo Breaker or anything that's just huge.
Well, most even largest tournaments, I think even Evo is usually the max matches you'll have to play is 20.
Even if you end up
Because I
in
remember
losers.
them mentioning once that that Bonchan had a run through losers that was like 15 or 17 matches or something.
I see. And I suppose that gets split up across a couple of days if you manage to get all the way to
Not
the top.
necessarily. Some tournaments just run the whole thing.
Alright then. Must take a lot of setups.
Well, you get a long break, but you don't exactly like to get to like go and rest or anything. You go eat food or something.
Yeah, I'm thinking
you
of the
might not.
esports stuff that at least I'm used to seeing where they have stuff on the next day usually for the very top of the tournament.
Yes, but
I
you've
guess they
also
only
seen
some of
Daigo
them do that.
Umehara sleeping on his bag. Not only that, this is a skill Daigo has built up for probably this reason. This isn't just, oh, Daigo falls asleep. No, Daigo probably sleeps like that on purpose.
Round 2. Fight.
The ability to just fall asleep on the floor on your very comfortable padded controller or arcade stick carrying bag. For all we know, that is in fact part of the will to keep winning.
I've not in fact read his book. I wonder if he has a chapter on that sort of management. Because it really would be the sort of thing you would need to know.
Final round. Fight.
So today has been a relatively large exercise in the team playing at not necessarily their worst. We don't technically know what that is. Hopefully we will not find out the theoretical worst that is not usually seen. But it's definitely below par.
Okay. Dead.
You lose.
And as a result, we are also coming to the end of the stream with the upcoming match or matches being the last. The lounge may stay open a little longer, but obviously, as we've been mentioning, we have a bunch of tired people, so that might not be so.
Round 1. Fight.
Ah. Ow.
But it's exactly situations like this that help us build up that stamina.
Darn.
Round
playing while pushed to those heavy limits. Tomorrow, for the Tuesday train, Guilty Gear at Zargrab 2, we expect to be less tired. But we may see some more characters. There's still some training going on for various things, Frosty Faustings and so on. So we may get to see a bit more of that. In conjunction with some calmer approaches to things than we've been seeing recently for various reasons. On Wednesday, Sandbag Casuals. Probably in Street Fighter V, we have no reason to shift game at this point. And on Thursday, Kame House Lobbies, our Dragon Ball FighterZ Beginner Lounge. Finally on Friday, we'll be having our Dead or Alive last round content, one more lobby, and bringing us back around to next week Monday for another Mish-Mashing Lounge. However, with that jumping medium punch, we've come to the end of our stream for the night. This has been Rillian along with Hanzuki Dynasty 14 to MK. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.